Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. I'd like to get the shilling out of the way right in the front really quickly. Share with friends and like, please. We're at the growth stage of this channel. We think we've got a solid product. People like it. People come back for more. Our subscribers watch the shows. You can kind of look at ratios of how many people subscribe to how many people actually watch your show. Our ratio is really good. So we have a good solid base of support. And so we just need to let like-minded people know about it. So, you know who they are, who would find this sort of stuff interesting. So please let them know. And that would be a big help to the channel that doesn't cost you much except a little bit of time. And like the video. And then if you do want to give us some coin, virtual or not, there's Subscribestar in the video description, as well as a public Bitcoin wallet. Great time to give us Bitcoin, because evidently it's not worth as much anymore. So let's donate on the down cycle or something. I don't know. Anyway, okay. Well, let me bring on Ryan Turnipseed from Oklahoma. And Ryan, you are particularly proud to be from Oklahoma today. Why is that, Ryan?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. So
Hi.
our house just passed a Texas-styled abortion law that prohibits abortion from conception,
Wow.
recognizing life to be starting at conception. So we've joined in ranks with Texas. This will go immediately into effect if Roe gets overturned, and until then, we keep our current restrictive laws on the books, if I understand correctly.
So wait, when you say house,
Um,
does that mean is it actually, House, Senate? I mean,
yeah,
it needs to be signed
yeah,
and all
yeah.
that
It went
stuff,
through.
right?
It went through both.
Okay,
It
okay.
just hasn't been signed yet. The House had it had 78 votes for it and 19 against it. The Senate had 73 votes for it and 16 against it. So
Wow.
yeah, it's pretty good.
And then you would expect the governor to sign this, I guess.
Oh yeah, he signed the last one.
Okay.
We did this with another one that wasn't as restrictive. It didn't go to conception. And he's already said, I believe about a month ago or so, and then during his election and all these other things, that he would sign any pro-life law that hit his desk. So
Right. Yeah, so you're not worried about that part. Okay, so
no,
this is very briefly visiting something that I learned about when there was a discussion, I think Prudentialist channel. Anyway, you were on it, I think, about
yeah,
once we got the news that it looked like Roe versus Wade, the leak that suggests that Roe versus Wade might be overturned. I learned something I didn't realize. You just mentioned it, but you could expand on it for just a sec, which is the what do they call it? Basically the trigger laws. Yeah. So these are laws that have been sitting there in some cases since 1973, since the Roe versus Wade decision, right? And
yes.
they haven't been doing anything because basically, I mean, did they write it that way in the law, or is that just because of the way the Supreme Court works? It's nullified until the Supreme Court changes its mind. How does this work?
Well, it depends because either can happen. But for the ones where it is not just stating whenever the federal court allows it, um, you can try to enforce it, but
Mm,
that will usually get taken to the Supreme Court, and that's kind of how you get the situation that we're in right now.
right.
So it can be provoked at the state level, and of course, as it always is with U.S. politics, you can have states that will just enforce an unconstitutional law from the Supreme Court's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter what they say about Roe versus Wade. A state can still very much enforce a law that is against it, um, and it just has to go up to the court, and then the
Right,
court
right,
has
right.
to
It
side with
gets
someone. And then
challenged.
right, so
Right.
there's always that to play with.
So, number one, this was completely new to me. I was 4 in 1973, so I missed the trigger laws being passed back then somehow. So I didn't know they were there. And also the other thing, and I don't know if you remember the details on this, there's kind of a lot of them. It's not like it's
Yeah,
just in Oklahoma or something, or just in southern conservative states or something like that. there's kind of quite a few states where the moment Roe versus Wade is overturned, boom, the landscape changes on this, right?
Yes. And there's a lot of so it turns out whenever this decision was made in 1973, killing children was not the most popular political position. Um, you might recall who was the guy that ran against Reagan? His name is escaping my mind right now.
Mondale.
Yes, Mondale.
Yeah.
Yes, one of his positions was that it should be fully legal, which was an extremely controversial position for the time, and might have cost him the election with such radical policy,
Wow.
regardless of who his opponent was. And so a lot of states, Democrat or Republican, did pass anti-abortion legislation. Now, in the modern day, whether or not they would enforce that is a different story, and that's
Yeah,
what we
right,
talked
right.
about on Credentialist Stream. But even then, on the state level, things are a lot more pro-life than the federal level might make things out to be.
Right. Okay. So the trigger laws would technically come into effect the moment that Roe versus Wade gets overturned. How many of them would get enforced, though, is going to probably come down to whether you have a Democratic controlled legislature and governor or Republican controlled legislature and governor in each of those states, right?
Right. And then not just Democrat and Republican, but pro-life Democrat or Republican, because
Right,
that does get murky on the state level. It's not like the federal level where Democrat just means they're pro-choice and then Republican means they're pro-life. On the state level, you can get that variation depending on the person. As you can see, in Oklahoma, at the very least, our Democratic Party is much more pro-life in most issues. They're obviously more likely to match their federal counterparts, but it's not a done deal. And then, as with everything in U.S. politics, it's always about enforcement. So you can get nominally pro-life people say they're going to enforce it, and then they actually don't, as anyone might expect if you've been paying attention to the GOP for any point in time ever.
Right.
So that's always the consideration here. Basically, the fervor of the governor and the potentially law enforcement, National Guard, if it comes to that, all these other things.
Okay, so you might be thinking, I don't usually get culture war red meat when I come to the Radical Liberation channel. What's going on here? It's Ryan. Ryan's influenced him. No, what is happening is that I thought this was a very nice segue. For one thing, this is on everyone's mind for obvious reasons. It would be an epic shift in modern U.S. history if Roe versus Wade is overturned. No question about it. Whatever you feel about the issue, Roe versus Wade being overturned would be a big political event, right?
Right.
And so we're going to do a good old classic Mises.org article day today. And they have one that I think is a little bit spicy, sparked by a rather spicy comment. So let's go to the article, which is, excuse me, I need to scroll it up so we can see it. Here we go. Yeah. The unborn's dying wish, the abortion of the Fed. Okay, now I should have the quote ready and I don't. What did Janet Yellen say? It was kind of crazy. Abortion, low income. Okay, let me see if I can just pull it up. Okay, Yellen. Where's this Yellen quote here? Oh, I can't get the actual quote. Why can't people just...
Here.
Why can't people just put
the
actual quote?
If you want to start the article, I can probably pull it.
Yeah, I've got everybody paraphrasing. Just quote the darn words that she said. Okay, see if you can find the actual quote. Anyway, okay, so Jeffrey Degner wrote this article, and he says, in a moment that would have made the progressive eugenicist Margaret Sanger proud, former Fed Chair Janet Yellen extolled the virtues of high abortion rates among poor women as they allow them to have higher labor force participation rates. Immediately, Ryan, there's so many angles on this, right? I mean, why is it so important to have high labor participation rates, labor force participation rates, that we should like kill children? Anyway, but too much to unpack all at once. Let's get through the article. We'll hit these points. So her argument was plain. It is cruel for parents to bring children into a state of poverty. Therefore, it is humane to incentivize abortion among the poor. And this is a classic argument I've heard all my life, right? It's basically goes back to the life not worth living argument. And I don't know, do you know, Ryan, I remember reading about that going back to, I'm sorry, what's it called when you kill my mind's gone blank. When you kill like mentally retarded people and stuff like that, like they were doing in Germany.
You're not talking about eugenics, are you?
Yeah, it's kind of like eugenics, but there's another term. Anyway, this life not worth living is a phrase that's like 100 years old at least. And it's this notion that based on someone's birth defect, based on being born into poverty, being unwanted, right? That's a big one that gets mentioned. This is a life not worth living, and we can judge that for that person, that potential, or that life, and just terminate it for their own good, basically, to keep them from having an unpleasant life. So it's an old argument. Degner says this is paraphrasing Sanger, her kinds of arguments. It's the argument in this case that a life of poverty is not worth living, which is I don't know, in my view, a somewhat odd view. But anyway,
as if nothing has ever come from anyone impoverished.
Yeah, right. The poor you shall always have among you, Jesus said. Okay, so then Democratic Party representative Katie Porter from California remarked that, well, this is not in Congress, but before an CNBC audience, remarked that things like inflation can happen as a justification for the Democrats' now failed attempt to enshrine unfettered abortion access in federal law. By the way, that came and, well, I don't watch the news, Ryan, but I got the feeling that came and went with barely a whisper, that they lost a Senate vote 49-51, where they were trying to just make Roe versus Wade, just legislate it. So then it wouldn't be dependent on the Supreme Court anymore, right?
Right. So that did, and I was surprised more people didn't talk about it. We had people in our sphere saying that it was all like political facade and circuses. But I don't think it was. Usually in politics, if you have a vote that you know the outcome of, it's not usually that close. You don't usually go 49-51, where the vice president was planning to break the tie.
Mm-hmm.
You typically don't have that. Usually in politics, if there's a vote where you know the outcome, there's like a margin of 10 to 10 or higher people. So our group of people, our friends, are very quick to dismiss anything happening in legislation as just being pre-planned. I think that's a very wrong view. Obviously, there is pre-planning. Politics is very much a game to most of these people, and definitely a show to the people above them. But 49-50, hard to engineer that, especially when you have people that are supposedly in the dissenting faction, the GOP, the people that voted no, that otherwise probably would have gone for this. I can't imagine what the party whip was having to pull up on every single GOP member in order to get them to vote no.
Right.
So just that perspective there.
Yeah. I thought that was sort of a stunning little political development. I thought it'd be more of something people would talk about more, and it was like all over, and then I saw the vote and I was like, what? I didn't even know that was happening. But anyway, price of not watching the news, I guess. Okay, so let's continue with where they're taking this. So inflation, what? So we're talking about enshrining unfettered abortion access in federal law, and Representative Porter brings up inflation. Things like inflation can happen.
So
yeah,
keep in mind people are not working with a sane concept of inflation. They are working with price and where it is correlated with GDP growth. It's correlated with money supply growth. It's correlated with all these other things. So if the GDP slows, then by their standards, we're in inflation, regardless of the money supply. So that's the frame they're operating on. By redefining this one simple concept of inflation, you can tie in literally every single other issue just to push a left-wing agenda.
Right, but this article, I think, sort of takes it seriously. Takes what you could see as sort of an ignorant use of the word inflation and sort of runs with it. But I think you'll see that it brings up a really serious point. So he says her comment begs the question: if inflation goes to zero, then does the need for abortions among the poor go away as well?
Right.
Okay. So, in a modern wealthy society, the households that are harmed by lost purchasing power from money supply expansion are less likely to bring children into the world, all things held equal. Now, this might seem like a bold claim, but this is a cold kind of thing, but hey, this is economics, get used to it. Realism tells us that incentives matter. The incentives that face people matter. Costs matter. And so Gary Becker and Robert Barrow contend that real net costs in raising children reduce total fertility in families. Now, this might seem like, oh no, people aren't that, calculating. If I had it ready, this would be the point to read the hilarious passage from quote from Mr. Darling in Peter and Wendy, where he's computing whether they can afford to have each child and whether they can afford to keep them. The child's born, the mother's holding the child, and he's running the numbers to decide if if we scrimp here and save here, okay, we'll keep Wendy, or we'll keep John or whatever, Anyway, it's great.
Like scrap. Great, and all this other stuff.
Great passage. You know what? I love that so much, and I keep bringing it up. Maybe like that Douglas Adams thing, I should just do a short video, Ryan, where I just read that passage.
Yeah.
Shall we keep the baby? Or I'll call it something like that. Anyway, because it deserves to be called out on its own. It's so funny. Anyway, so this isn't to sort of reduce people to the way Mr. Darling is being satirized in that wonderful passage. But I have to say, as a father of 8 children who talks to people about having babies, not even asking them, right? I have 8 children. Suddenly people start telling me how they feel about having children. I didn't ask them. They just volunteer it, right? It's just a thing that happens. And I have to admit, a lot of people say, oh, it's just it was too expensive. We don't think we can raise, the number of children maybe we would like to have for other reasons, but our finances tell us we can't do it or whatever. I personally don't think that's the way to think about it. But anyway, it does have an impact on people's thinking. I don't think that's unrealistic, what Becker and Barrow are contending here. An ongoing loss of real income and wealth can be among the data points that people use to derive their preferences. I think it's true. And then this is where it gets interesting. The reality that the poor in the U.S., we can think about the reality that the poor in the U.S. are among those harmed by money supply expansion as articulated by Richard Cantillon. So what are they talking about there? They're talking about the Cantillon effect, and that is that money is not dropped evenly onto everybody in the economy when the money supply expands. Some people get the money first. In the old days, I guess it would have been like gold miners, right? They'd get the gold first, mined out of the ground or whatever, right? But now it's the politically connected because the Federal Reserve expands the money supply. And so it probably goes first to like defense contractors, etc. Those who are sort of closest to the supply of money, big banks, things like that. Who gets it last after the effects of say price inflation have happened because of the money supply expansion? Well, the poor, right?
Right.
So that's part of the point that's being made here is that that ongoing loss of real income and wealth in part can be that Cantillon effect, which is, we're not going to cover it today, but is totally real in terms of the effects of the Fed. So he says um, right. So the increasing lack of purchasing power over time creates the tendency for these households to have fewer children than they otherwise would have. Um, and in most wealthy nations, child labor and panhandling are unnecessary because those nations have enriched themselves via the International Division of Labor. This has also had the welcome effect of eliminating a household's perceived need to supply children to traffickers, which sadly remains a scourge of the developing world. Um, so we're in kind of a different situation in wealthy countries as we think about having children. But Jeffrey Degner says what Becker and Barrow fail to account for is that wealthy and poor nations alike may also allow fiat central banking. And by leaving this out, it fails to capture the reality of a harmed class, as you know, because of Cantillon effects, who lose purchasing power over time under inflationary regimes. So the poor get hit harder by the actions of, say, the Federal Reserve of the United States, right? And then they mention, well, I have to mention it really quickly, The Ethics of Money Production by Guido Hulsmann, because I edited it, where he talked about the ethics of fiat currency. And he says fiat inflation is a juggernaut of social, economic, cultural, and spiritual destruction. That is, we see these larger effects of inflation on like the culture, on like values. Inflation becomes a means to lower the cost of reckless behavior in financial markets. And this author suggests that if that's so, and he's talking about Seyfeddin Ammous there, if that is so, that inflation sort of supports reckless behavior, you can easily suggest that inflationism might generate moral hazard and sexual behavior as well, right? That is to, go around and impregnate women and not worry about the consequences and so forth.
Right.
So go ahead.
I have a quote from Yellen that I tried to transcribe.
Thank you.
So one of the main ones, anyways, that I saw in the news. She said, quote, eliminating the right of women to make their own choices would have very damaging effects on the economy and would set women back decades. Roe v. Wade helped lead to increased labor force participation, enabled more women to finish school, reach their earning potential, allowed women to plan and balance their families and careers, and research also shows that it had a favorable impact on the well-being and earnings of children. So that was the main quote that I saw, and that's what the clip.
Right, thank you. And this feels to me somewhat along the lines of I don't remember who it was, but some actress was getting an Oscar, and she said, like, this is possible. She's holding up the Oscar. This is possible because I killed my children, which seems pretty dark to me personally. Dark calculus, right?
How many people can I kill to benefit myself? Yeah.
Right. Okay, so if Yellen and Porter's shared goal is to continue to boost female labor force participation and engage women in what Joseph Pieper called proletarianization, where total work is the norm, then the inflation-abortion connection is certainly an effective means to achieve it. So that is, we don't want these women staying home and raising a bunch of children. We want them, as we have now, a generous 12 weeks to stay with your baby. Is becoming common at big companies, at least. Maternity leave. Parental leave. The fathers get to stay home too if they want. But anyway, the mom gets to stay home with her little one for 12 weeks and then, get back in there participating in the labor force, please, because we got to keep our labor force participation up. I find this point really interesting, Ryan, because it's something that Academic Agent has been hitting on for some time, asking the question that, in so many ways we can say, yeah, we have modern conveniences and we have technology that we didn't have in 1300 or whatever. But, what is life like for the average working stiff? Are they working more hours or less hours? And he raises questions about whether, our assumption would be that in the past everybody was just working themselves to death, and he's like, I don't know. It's can't tell from that long ago, right? We couldn't have super accurate information, but he sees indications that maybe the working stiff now in a lot of ways has like less vacation, and basically is more of a more proletarianized, to use this Joseph Pieper phrase, right?
Right. And this has been the goal of multiple U.S. governments or administrations since basically the 60s, was to get women into the workforce, because obviously they were pressed into the workforce during World War II primarily, where on the graphs production went up, and that got translated to, we need women in the workforce all the time because look at how much production we can have even while fighting the war. So who knows what it could be like at peacetime.
Right.
So thereafter, every single moderate politician, quote unquote, from either party, pushed for things that would get women into the workforce, be it trying to push for contraceptive legalization on the state level or the federal level, trying to push for more radical justices to be appointed to the Supreme Court. Some people wanted to adjust.
Here, mute. Getting one of those darn emergency.
Okay, sorry. Where was I? Some senators, if I remember correctly, I think one Margaret Chase Smith, a Republican from Maine, advocated for adjusting Social Security and other welfare benefits to benefit women who spent more time in the labor force as opposed to being a mother. So you had all of these initiatives being pushed from the federal government and sometimes the state governments, trying to get women into the workforce. And you can tell it's an artificial development that women are in the workforce by the fact that it has to be legislated so heavily and incentivized so terribly much. I mean, here we have the Federal Reserve telling the nation that you have to keep killing your children, otherwise the line will go down.
Right. Yeah. And I don't know that I've really directly we've addressed it here and there, and we've joked about line go up and stuff. But let me just directly address it. I think part of the reason that economics has a bad reputation, especially among like social conservatives and traditionalists, is that it's associated with that line go up mentality, right?
Right. The economy, the GDP needs to be increasing at a constant rate, and economic growth is the main priority. That's what people don't like.
Right, and that overcomes family cohesion, marital cohesion, not killing your babies. All of that is gladly sacrificed in the favor of making the line go up, increasing productivity, increasing GDP, etc. Hopefully it's clear if you've watched this channel at all, that is not the perspective of the Austrian School of Economics. It's not the perspective of Ryan. It's not the perspective of me. Economics is, if you learn it properly, which I try to teach on this channel, if you learn it properly, it's an extremely powerful tool for understanding the world around you. And it is value neutral, but I think ultimately, if you understand it well, it has a very humane aspect to it. And I would think Austrian economists in general, almost to a man, are not going to be saying, hey, sacrifice all cultural values, sacrifice your community, sacrifice your family so that the line can go up on the GDP line, right? In fact, that's the very opposite of our orientation, which is that these the economy is there, economic productivity is there to support properly. It should be there to support you, your family, your community, not to tear it apart, right? The people who use it, the people who use economics as an excuse to attack the family, I don't think it's because they're just awesome free market economists. I think they hate. I think they have an agenda anyway, and they use economics as an excuse. Right.
Right. And you can see this underscored perfectly in the definition of economic growth from the Austrian perspective, and then contrasting it to the mainstream perspective. to any mainstream economist, economic growth is making sure that GDP per capita keeps increasing. To the Austrian economist, though, economic growth is satisfying more wants of people, right?
Right.
So just by that very definition, you can see where the perspectives are. For
Yeah.
the mainstream, economic growth centers around this very sort of ethereal concept of gross domestic product that itself is very shaky mathematically to
Yeah.
calculate,
Right.
that somehow just gets imparted onto people per capita, and that tells you how good people are doing.
Right.
Whereas for the Austrian economists, economic growth is how many of your wants are satisfied.
Right.
That's simple.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to make it clear where this channel stands, we're not afraid of the line going down as long as the right things are happening. Um, okay. Well, I'll just read you his final line just for fun because he has to sort of play on words a little. If it is indeed the case that an increased likelihood of abortion among the poor is one of the myriad social consequences of the Fed's currency debasement, then the would-be born could also rejoice at the central bank's abortion. We don't like the Fed, we Austrians. Okay, so let's move on to another article, which I gotta switch here. Give me just a sec. Ryan is going to help us on this one because, man, my work has been crazy lately, and I didn't even get to prep this one. So, what happens when central banks attempt to tighten? Even more resource misallocation. Okay, before it even starts, I can just react to that. The assumption would be, right, that, Austrians are always complaining about misallocation of resources because of artificially low interest rates. And so we're complaining about the loose policy of the central bank, right?
Right.
It's generating too much credit. It's artificially lowering the inflation rate, and so
Right.
we just want the opposite, right? We want the central bank there. We just want it to have a tight monetary policy. So that would be
Right.
sort of something you might think, but that's not right,
Right.
right, Ryan?
Even if it's not just one or the other, even if say we get some like really intelligent people heading the central bank and they see, well, by our calculations, it would be good to lower the interest rate right now because that would allow more people to borrow since it's cheaper. They don't have to pay more interest back to their loaner. Um, so they have this money, they go out and invest it when they otherwise would not have. The GDP increases, people are better off. That's the perspective usually of the central bank when they try to lower interest rates, implementing a loose policy. Uh, you know, that's the terminology. Loose means high or lower interest rates. Tight economic policy means higher interest rates. So what happens when they do implement a loose economic policy or monetary policy? Sorry. Well, usually you get bubbles. Things start to heat up. Is the central banking terminology. The economy will start to heat up. Money will be changing hands very quickly. And there's a lot of very questionable choices made now that money is cheaper. So, what then is the central bank to do? Well, if you go back to normal, the damage is already done if things are getting bad. So, surely the answer is to just heighten the interest rates, go to a tight monetary policy, and make loans more expensive to get. It incentivizes saving so that in the future there's more money to lend out. Only good things, right? So it's a correction. Well, not quite, because both of these are artificial monetary policies, artificial
Mm-hmm.
interest rates that would not have occurred naturally.
Right.
So sure, you can try to have the state fix its own problem, but usually when it does that, as we have come to know, it causes other problems.
Right. So what Austrians believe, right? It shouldn't be summed up as loose policy or tight policy, right? In fact, this is something Lou Rockwell realized after very, very quickly in doing the Mises Institute. He had a presence near Washington, D.C. at first, and then he changed his mind and he said, no, we're just going to be in Auburn. And that represented a whole philosophical shift of what the Mises Institute was about. That is, the Mises Institute was not going to be a policy think tank. That's what
Right.
probably you might think the Mises Institute is about. A policy think tank is um, oriented to um, advising the government on how to
Right.
micromanage the welfare warfare state, as I put it long ago in commenting on another institution that I won't name. Um, and that is not what Lou wanted to do with the Mises Institute, because the view of Austrian economics in regards, say, to this very important issue of interest rates and the money supply is that the very problem is that the state is doing it, right? Now, this should be a
Right.
very familiar argument from central planning and other areas of life, but for some reason, when it comes to money, people's brains go out the window just because of the constant propaganda, I guess. Um,
Well,
you know that you know that where if you go to a free market type like an Austrian, you know they're going to say the government should not be managing the supply of shoes and etc. Right, or food. You know, we should leave that to the market. Well, it's the exact same thing for Austrians, not for Chicago School, but for Austrians, we're consistent and we apply that to money. The supply of money, and even what money is, ought to be left to the market. So the objection is not to, it is in part to the Fed having loose monetary policy or whatever, but really that's just because their policy tends to be loose. The real objection is that the Fed exists, right?
right.
So that's where you leave the policy think tank mode and go into the radical mode, right? There's
Radical
a reason.
restructuring.
Yeah. Where we don't want reform, we want abolition, right? So sorry, Ryan, you've had comments. Go ahead.
Right. So, objection to the Federal Reserve itself does set us apart, most certainly, and you can uh, you can see this here. We have a quote by Mises. Mises. He is talking about what happens if we do start getting inflation. What should the Federal Reserve do? So he's responding to someone that is saying, well, then we should just induce deflation from the Federal Reserve in order to fix the problems. And if you don't mind me reading it out,
Now,
Mises says,
is this the Percy Greaves?
yeah, yeah.
Okay,
So,
yeah. So this is Percy Greaves writing, but summarizing what Mises said. So go ahead.
Right. Mises also refers to the fact that deflation can never repair the damage of a priori inflation. In his seminar, he often likened such a process to an auto driver who had run over a person and then tried to remedy the situation by backing over the victim in reverse. Inflation so scrambles the changes in wealth and income that it becomes impossible to undo the effects. Then, too, deflationary manipulations of the quantity of money are just as destructive of market processes, guided by unhampered market prices, wage rates, and interest rates, as are such inflationary manipulations of the quantity of money. So, earlier, when we were talking about why people want to do this, there is propaganda, certainly, but there's also a mathematical argument that gets made, and it seems really, really plausible if you don't question the base assumptions, and we'll get to that soon. But this is operating off from what we would say are correct assumptions, operating from the Austrian standpoint. If the state forcefully does something and it causes an issue, the solution is not automatically have the state do the opposite thing in order to remedy the issue, as it balances out. So, maybe it works once or twice, but it's not how things work. We would call those coincidences. So, I mentioned earlier that the loose monetary policy will cause bubbles. The tight monetary stance, heightening interest rates, it can most certainly deflate those bubbles. But as we just heard from Mises, and we'll get into more detail, it causes other distortions.
Okay.
So
brilliant. So brilliant. I love his analogy. It's really
yeah. I mean,
remedy it by backing over the victim in reverse. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's keep going. What else do you want to pull from the article here?
Right. So let's go into the propaganda, because we've already established the Federal Reserve, if it does induce deflation to remedy its inflation, you're just messing with signals. It's harder for people to actually work with what they have. And you also mess with time preferences and the actual interest rate that would be happening, that would come about had the Federal Reserve not tampered. So we talked about earlier, state intervention will affect not just material and economics, it will affect people, right? So we were talking earlier in the last article about the Federal Reserve pressuring the state to keep abortion legalized, to keep the graph from to keep the line on the graph from going down, to help inflation and all this other stuff. Um, that impacts people. It will impact their time preferences. So, in the context of monetary policy, if the interest rate is much lower and money is cheaper for me to get and invest, you know, I'm not going to think about saving. I'm going to think about spending and investing. And there's also the other side of the coin. I'm not going to put as much money into the bank. The interest rate's really low. I need to go throw money at something in hopes that it doesn't depreciate. So, all of this messing with signals, none of it is good in one direction or the other, because in one way you're basically just going to be destroying something. So, on the one hand, if you have a loose policy, you mess with the signals such that the time preferences will increase. People value their time much more. They want things now. They will take that money. They won't save for the future. For whatever reason they might justify it with, they'll throw money at things and you get a bubble. On the other hand, if you have too tight an economic policy, people will only save, right? And they won't think about now. So there is such a thing to where the state can induce too much saving and just constrict people from being entrepreneurs, right? That's the other thing. So too much saving. We're in such a time right now that sounds impossible. It is very much possible. There are cultures where all you can do is save, usually by means of throwing money at your extended family, and there is no entrepreneurial ability available.
I
so you do get that problem on the other side.
Right. So you're not just talking about saving versus consumption spending. You're talking about saving versus even investment spending, where you only save, and you don't. Usually we think, well, if it's being saved, it's being invested. But you're saying in the worst case scenario, sure, you're saving money. That's great, but you're literally not doing anything with it. You're not building for the future.
Right. Taking it to its absurdity. Right.
Yeah.
So, like on the other hand, usually when we talk about lowering interest rates, people don't just suddenly look at the news, the interest rates are down, I have to throw money everywhere. This just comes about because that becomes the best decision given the circumstances. Similar thing on the other side, it just goes in the other direction. So, what is the Federal Reserve thinking if this is what happens? Well, they rely on, actually, their main goal is what's called stable growth, which we can see kind of in the a third of the way through the article. Can the central bank policies maintain stable growth? The Federal Reserve, being as it is primarily a planning institution, is all about predicting things. They want things to be predictable. They want things to be stable. They want their lines to be what comes up in their models. So, to quote from the article, most experts are of the view that a major obstacle for the attainment of stable growth, that is, the thing preventing the planners from getting their stable growth state, are the fluctuations of federal funds rate around the neutral interest rate. So, basically, they are worried about the Federal Reserve overshooting or undershooting what they should be producing in order to get that stable growth. What the heck is the neutral interest rate? The neutral interest rate, it is held, is the one consistent with stable prices and a balanced economy. So it's almost circular. The Federal Reserve is after very stable prices, stable growth. And to do that, they need to target the neutral interest rate. What is the neutral interest rate? It's the one that produces stable prices and stable growth. So all this amounts to is the Federal Reserve needs to manage its funds so that their models come true. Just to put it that simple.
And I think I guess there'd be a distinction, right, between the neutral interest rate and what we might call like the natural interest rate, like what the interest rate would be if the Fed wasn't fiddling with it and there was just a natural supply and demand of the money supply. These are probably not the same because, for one thing, the Fed doesn't and can't know what the natural interest rate would be, because for
Well,
one thing, the Fed exists.
yeah. Well, here's
Right?
the catch: they can't know the other interest rate either. They don't know
Right.
either of these, but we'll get.
Right. Right. Okay, keep going.
So, yeah, don't confuse the two. The natural interest rate is just what happens without intervention. The neutral interest rate is what comes from the desk of the Federal Reserve. So, one is entirely state planned, if you will. The other one is entirely natural. It's just coincidence that they sound so similar. So, skipping to the bottom of this paragraph, well, to summarize the middle, the Federal Reserve can't know either. We don't know what the natural interest rate is because the Federal Reserve has prevented us well and truly from seeing that probably in our lifetime, bar some miracle. And the neutral interest rate has so many factors in it, from people's wants to economic conditions to environmental effects. Natural disasters can definitely change someone's preferences, for instance, to politics, to war, to all these other things, that it's almost impossible for the Federal Reserve to know what interest rate it needs to hit. So, how does it come up with the neutral interest rate? How does the Federal Reserve derive this? They use a bunch of mathematical models that are designed to basically to remove all these other factors as if they're in a natural laboratory, I believe would be the term for other sciences. So they remove all these other factors to try to see what the interest rate is in their economic lens, and they try to aim for that. One of the mathematical models is called the Kalman filter. So why wouldn't this work? If we assume that all of their math is correct, why is it bad? Well, they assume the existence of aggregate supply and demand. That's what they operate off of in all of these mathematical models, is that there is such a thing as aggregate supply and aggregate demand. That is, they sum up the supply of everything and they sum the demand of everything. To the Austrian, this is insane because supply and demand can only really work on an individual level. It's hard to add
Yeah.
demand, for
Right.
instance. It's a very subjective thing. Same thing with supply. How many computers is equal to one tractor? That's simplifying a little bit, but it's not too terribly far off to how they treat aggregate supply in an economy. So whenever the Federal Reserve tries to use these concepts that can only exist in aggregate, can't be aren't looking at individuals, you get some really wacky results like loose monetary policy and tightened monetary policy. So the article here goes into a very good argument as to why general equilibrium is a fiction. That is why those aggregate demand curves and aggregate supply curves can't really help you reach aggregate equilibrium, if you will, or general equilibrium. And that's because equilibrium is only an individual thing. Satisfying your wants can only happen on the individual level. That's to summarize all of this.
Right.
And I think that we've covered most of the article at that point.
Yeah,
I thought it was just
worth calling
going to
out.
see-
Worth calling out, Ryan. I'm sure that with the schooling you're doing now, you're totally seeing this. Don't be baffled by the cargo cult economics here, right? Here we are doing lots of impressive math, and so science, right, with a capital S.
right.
You've got to look at the actual logic of these things, and not be baffled by the mathematics.
Right, exactly.
Right, and
So,
the fact that they can drone on and on about how they've factored this out and that out to get to the neutral rate, you need to start by saying, well, how can you even know that?
right.
Ever, no matter how awesome your math is, or does it even make sense? Like in the sense of aggregate supply and demand curves, is that even a thing that makes sense at all conceptually? So there's a lot of fancy math that I'm sure from a mathematics point of view is cool, but if you dig, you'll find that the assumptions and the logic of it, the underlying logic of it, is terrible, is really weak, right?
And this is going to be really important for you, the viewer, to know, because in the way that our society works, you get one side pushing for things like money printing, or I say one side, it's most of them at various points, pushing for money printing, loose monetary policy, trying to get the economy going. They're going to be the one to bring jobs back. They're going to bring economic growth. Everything's going to be great. Your wages are going to go up. And then when that all hits the fan, for reasons that we've discussed, there's suddenly going to be a backlash, or they could change heart and say, well, now we need to tighten monetary policy, and that will really bring us back to where we should be. Now you know why both of those are terrible ideas, and you won't be fooled into supporting one or the other in this sort of false dichotomy like the system wants you to.
Yeah, they talk about inflation doves, inflation hawks. Pick your team.
Yeah.
Right? As usual, they want you to pick a team in a game that they've designed where no matter which team you pick, you lose. Right? This is the pattern we see over and over. Okay, well, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for this last one. So I'm going to jump. Ready?
Ready.
Okay, so I'm going to... Right, so as promised, McDonald's. I don't think this is silly at all. I think this is really an interesting topic. It was really considered significant when the first McDonald's opened in Moscow in 1990 in the Soviet Union. You know, the Soviet Union with the concentration camps and stuff. McDonald's opened. Okay, was this seen as like, you know, you're supporting Soviet concentration camps? You know, what about the war in Afghanistan? The Soviets' war in Afghanistan. You know, are you selling to these people who have invaded Afghanistan? Well, somehow, as Ryan McMacken in this article makes clear, somehow engaging economically with the Soviet Union at that time was considered a way to, you know, either neutral or actually militating against policies that were not liked, like the invasion of Afghanistan or the general repression in the Soviet Union. And now, as you may know, companies view the way to help the situation as to withdraw. So, simplifying it a little, but not much, 30 years ago, engaging was the thing to do for companies. Now, withdrawing is the thing to do.
Right.
What? What in the heck? Okay, so let's walk through some details here, and then we'll. Okay, yeah. So, yeah. So McDonald's has announced it will permanently leave Russia, closing 850 outlets. The CEO explained that the move was motivated by the humanitarian crisis caused by the war in Ukraine, and that the current situation does not offer the same hope and promise that led us to enter the Russian market 32 years ago.
Right.
Their continued presence in Russia is not consistent with McDonald's values. Well, Ryan says this is a kind of a remarkable thing to say from a corporation that apparently has few qualms about keeping stores open in places like, say, Saudi Arabia, where war crimes, don't forget Yemen, the horrors of Yemen, where war crimes and human rights violations are standard operating procedure. So why are they closing it now? Yeah, well, I'll use his words to say what I said earlier. The ideological shift toward withdrawing from politically unpopular foreign markets signals a real change from earlier ideas about global corporate investment. Once upon a time, having American companies in foreign nations was seen as a sign of American superiority over the local regime, an instrument of American soft power. And it was seen this way by the other side, by the way. Communist regimes regarded American companies as a form of Western bourgeois imperialism and tended to exclude them from local markets. So it was like, you know, a big victory for McDonald's to finally get to open in Moscow, right? Because that had been resisted, because that brings American cultural influence and so forth. But now the drive to exclude American brands from foreign markets comes not from the evil governments over there, right? But from the Americans themselves. They're withdrawing from the markets. And he credits in part calls for boycotts by American politicians and American social media users. So not only McDonald's, Starbucks is withdrawing from the Russian market. Coca-Cola is pausing its operations there. Okay. So here we have a new ideological paradigm which embraces economic isolationism and a Cold War mentality. And now the spread of American capital and American culture, instead of being like a way to spread our values, is a form of collaboration with foreign regimes. So something is really, this is why I wanted to make this the headline article for today, because this is a kind of a massive shift, right?
Mm-hmm.
From a certain point of view, maybe nothing's changed, which we'll get to. But nevertheless, this is a real difference in the engagement of American companies in countries that are viewed as, not having the right politics or whatever. Okay, so yeah, so Ryan says, in many ways, this attitude is even worse than what prevailed during the Cold War, when American companies and American diplomats sought to open the USSR's markets to American products. Today, the virulent Russophobia is extreme even by the standards of the days when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and American politicians called the USSR the evil empire. And I remember when Reagan, he said American politicians. I thought it was mostly Reagan who said that. But anyway, I remember I was alive back then when President Reagan called the USSR the evil empire. The mass media was full of denunciations saying that this was very simplistic and, and so on and so forth. They didn't like it that he said that, right?
Okay.
So now the regime is completely united, of course. The president and Congress and every big company, all these things that we realize now are just part of the regime. They're all united in denouncing Russia. Back then, there was actually a split in denouncing the Soviet Union. Okay, so so the old view, cultural imperialism, so-called, right? So this was seen as a win in the past, and he gives some great examples. In East Germany, Coca-Cola after the Second World War quickly became a symbol of Western capitalist decadence. So the East German regime in the 50s, I did not know this, sought to produce its own brand of cola while keeping American brands out of the marketplace. Well, you can guess how that went. Their cola proved to be inferior in every way, from the taste to the bottle caps. But for diehard communists, even that was terrible. That was capitulation to Western ideals, even to try to make a Coca-Cola-like drink. Milena Venus, from the anti-Western viewpoint, anything reminiscent of an American soft drink was an emblem of the horrific American, scare quotes, civilization, criticized as such in Polish poet Adam Wasik's 1952 poem, Song of Coca-Cola. Okay? So, but again, both sides saw it this way, right? Whether you were like a commie behind the Iron Curtain or you were a pro-Western Cold Warrior, everyone saw this kind of the same way from each side. It's we'll win if we get Americans brands there, or on the other side, we'll lose if American brands come to us. Let's see.
Right, and it might be worth noting for some of the historians out there, this isn't the first time that Germans tried to alter Coca-Cola. We get Fanta from shortages during mid-century era, where they had to alter the formula. So the comic in me would say this might be less of a the failure might be less of a economic thing and more of a Germans trying to alter Coca-Cola thing.
Yeah, right. Trying once again. I had to share this detail. I thought this was just sort of fascinating. So Pepsi in 1974 managed to become the first capitalist brand produced in the Soviet Union. So in other words, Coca-Cola, I guess, was already there, maybe? I don't know. But this was the first time it was produced in the Soviet Union. But because no one wanted Soviet money in the United States, Pepsi settled accounts with the Soviets through barter. So the Soviets traded vodka for what they needed to produce Pepsi in the USSR, and Pepsi sold the vodka in Western markets.
Well, there's also another thing that they traded to Pepsi as well, if I remember correctly, and it was outdated parts of the Soviet Navy that Pepsi then either scrapped or sold off to other countries.
Anyway,
So
those were the days. Okay. Right. And he says, so throughout all of this, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and so forth being engaged, it should be kept in mind that there was nothing about the Soviet regime that could be described as liberal, open, nurturing of human rights, democratic, right? That's the big religion. They weren't Democrats, we shouldn't have anything to do with people who aren't democratic, unless they're the Saudi Arabia, right? But anyway, they operated prison camps. There were no real elections. There was no free press, free speech, free religion. But he says reasonable people recognized that selling cola in the USSR did not mean support for gulags. Then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Why does Ryan bring this up? Because there's certain parallels to Russia invading Ukraine, right? And sales of Pepsi's Russian vodka declined. Coke's long-standing sponsorship of the Olympic Games was threatened by the regime's boycott of the Moscow Olympics. But Ryan says because there's no Twitter mob in 1980, Coca-Cola ignored the boycott. And they simply insisted that selling soft drinks is something that transcends politics. And that was it. There was no frenzy of anti-Soviet sentiment leading to demands that they shut down their operations, and both Coke and Pepsi continued their operations throughout the Soviet-Afghan War. So that's not that long ago. I mean, it started in 79, but that war went on through the 80s. So we're talking about, 30 years ago. Where am I? Yeah, 30 years ago plus that this was the way things went. Well, now let's bring it forward. Oh, I'm sorry. He's going to tell a little bit more of the story. So McDonald's started making inroads. They opened restaurants in Yugoslavia and Hungary in 1988. But the arrival of McDonald's in the Soviet Union in January 1990 was a big deal. It struck at the heart of the communist world. Julieta Bisharian writes, as trivial as it may seem, the introduction of fast food in the USSR was undoubtedly revolutionary, as it represented Russia's struggle between conservatism and capitalist Western ideology. Excuse me. Oh boy. Sorry.
all right.
We're having a tornado. That's why this is making so much noise.
Ah, I see.
Okay, wait. Let me mute so you guys aren't. Okay, yeah. Just tornado warnings. It's the Midwest. Don't worry. Okay, let me finish that quote.
Yeah,
It stood as a token of America's efficiency, ingenuity, and speed. This restaurant, McDonald's, was the window to the world. So that's what I'm saying. I remember at the time it seemed like a big deal to everyone on both sides that McDonald's was opening in the USSR. Also, the Russians loved it. They waited for hours in the cold to get inside, and they had what by Soviet standards was like better food, and the cultural exchange did not flow both ways. Americans were not lining up at restaurant franchises with origins in the Soviet Union. So Americans weren't buying Soviet soft drinks. So the smell of a McDonald's hamburger in Moscow was the smell of defeat for the soon-to-be defunct Soviet regime. So, there were a number of things that happened, right? The Berlin Wall, McDonald's in Moscow, all leading up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it was seen that way at the time. So that is back then. And now let's talk about now. Now McDonald's says it wants out. Somehow the presence of McDonald's in Russia, for reasons never explained, it now signals approval of the regime. It didn't when it was the Soviet Union, which I thought of as a pretty bad regime, And he says those pushing withdrawal from Russia conveniently ignore that McDonald's maintains stores in many places where the local regime is infamous for violating human rights and for committing war crimes. And he points out that there's Egypt, there's Saudi Arabia, there's the horrible Saudi war in Yemen, notable for its brutality. And has McDonald's issued a press release on how it will close its stores in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, how it doesn't comport with its values? No. Also, this is a great point. McDonald's never expressed opposition to the U.S. regime when it was bombing Iraqi cities into rubble and executing an aggressive war that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. McDonald's is apparently fine with illegal military invasions so long as they're carried out by Americans. As I shared on my social media accounts just yesterday, I think, last night, former President George W. Bush had the most amazing gaffe of all time, where he said, in fact, I think I can pull it up from my social media real quick. Where is it? Yeah, here we go. He condemned the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. I mean of Ukraine. I'm not kidding. I've got the video. Check my Telegram or my Twitter or my Gab, and you will see it for yourself. We joke, but George W. Bush invaded Iraq, and McDonald's didn't find this, out of keeping with its values or something like that, right? So what in the heck? So anyway, Ryan argues that the point of this is not just to, hypocrisy, as we say. The point is that he thinks the old view of American multinationals is the better view. Selling a Coke in a foreign country is not an act that supports the regime. If anything, it undermines the regime, just as the commies of old understood. Now, having gotten through Ryan's point of view, Ryan McMackin's point of view, Ryan, we need to bring in our friend's point of view, right?
Yes.
So, how about you try another perspective on these global corporations?
Yeah. So, what a lot of our friends have come to analyze, and the conclusion that they have reached, is that these corporations are just arms of the state, and that's it. And that can explain their actions, past and present, for a long time. So, as we've discussed, they were viewed as a weapon in the Cold War. Therefore, the United States and the government would do everything that they can to get their corporations into the Soviet Union. And now that that's gone, now that they are still present there and they view it as some sort of leverage or weapon, being as it's just an arm of the state, the United States government can use it to support what their narrative is. And the narrative right now is that Russia is the big bad man and they're at war with Ukraine and they shouldn't be.
Right. So, from this perspective, McDonald's entering in 1990 and leaving in 2022 is, in a sense, almost no different from each other. In both cases, McDonald's is acting in harmony with the political regime, right? As an extension of the political regime in some sense, right?
Right.
I'm not saying I totally endorse this view, but just to spell it out for y'all. When it entered the Soviet Union in 1990, it was helping bring the Soviet Union down, and that's what the United States said it wanted. Though when it actually happened, they were kind of upset about it. But anyway, it's a different story. When McDonald's now is pulling out in 2022, once again, it's simply acting on behalf of the regime. I think, have we given a fair representation of the point of view?
I have a feeling that is what they would say, yes.
Right. So, I'm going into this cold. I have not fully thought through this. I don't know what I think. Actually, in fact, let me get rid of this article from our view and go back to our full view. I don't fully know what I think, Ryan, about that. I mean, it
helps explain certain
go ahead.
actions.
Yes.
It helps explain certain actions, but one of our friends has also sent us information that might also explain
why
McDonald's would be closing down some of their franchises.
Right. Well, let me start by reading the super chat from Aros Post. That's what you have in mind, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Aros Post, thank you for a very nice super chat, and also he sent additional information privately to us to support the story here. Get ready for this. McDonald's liabilities outweigh their assets on their balance sheet. And he sent us a screenshot of Yahoo Finance where you can see this. And when these numbers get big, Ryan, I get a little bit lost. But it looked to me that they didn't just outweigh it by a little. The liabilities outweighed the assets by a heck of a lot of money.
Yeah.
Right.
if I understand correctly, there's a difference between the two of 4,601,000.
Is that it, or is it billions?
Or is
What's our
it? Well, I
unit?
don't know.
What's
I
our unit
have
Oros post? Uh, I'm betting that
well,
that is $4.6 billion.
that would be insane, but given the current circumstances of the world, that would also be very plausible. So, on the graph, regardless of the units, there is quite a large discrepancy, and this is liabilities weighed against assets as well. So debt, right? Not just equity added in as well. So
Um, so he goes on to say it's worse than airline companies who are notorious for unprofitability. Ronald McDonald might need a bailout. And is there anything else we wanted to share from what he sent us?
well, I mean, this would be the other side to why would McDonald's suddenly be pulling out? Well, in most of their audiences that actually listen to news, that being the Western world, I would presume. I don't know how popular Western narratives are in the third world, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Jordan, and all these other places that were listed off in the article.
hmm.
This would be the perfect time to shut down franchises because it looks good for the media in the West. The rest of the world probably doesn't really care about it that much. Um, I find it almost comical to think about, a minister from Jordan or Yemen or Saudi Arabia trying to condemn McDonald's because of their statement on Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it also helps them fix this terrible situation here, where it's not looking too good.
Right. Now, there's another comment here that if we come at it from this cynical point of view, one might say, Ryan, and don't take McDonald's and their values at face value. Lowell says it's the fear of their dropping in the ESG index. The ESG index is the environmental,
Social
and governance, environmental, social, and governance index. And he says, Lowell says, and BlackRock is punishing companies who don't go along. BlackRock being a huge investment fund. So the regime, it isn't just President Biden saying stuff. There's a whole apparatus that causes companies to be on board with the current thing. And if they're not, they have ways. We have ways to make you suffer, right? So, by the way, that is one of the nuanced takes I have, Ryan, which is that yes, there's a whole managerial elite, as we've been talking about, spread throughout the NGOs, the governments, and the big companies, and they're all very similar in how they think. On the other hand, let's say you aren't one of those, and you just happen to be a CEO of a big company, and you're not really of the same mind as them. You know, you're secretly based or whatever, right? And you decide to not go with the current thing. Well, there's a lot of things that would prod you to do it anyway, like BlackRock and ESG indices and all kinds of pressures that would make it very hard to break from the pack. So you know, maybe I'm skeptical. Maybe Elon Musk, simply because he has so much money, is really going to break from the pack, and he's willing to face that friction. You know, and by the way, speaking of the ESG index, I asked Black Horse about the Elon Musk's company Tesla being thrown out of the S&P 500, and he said, whoa, careful there. It's the ESG S&P index. It's not the big S&P 500, the primary index. It's the ESG index, which means that Tesla was being given this special status. Hey, they do electric cars. They're a great company to invest in if you care about the environment, right? Well, now Elon Musk is being a bad boy, and suddenly he's out.
Yeah.
Right.
And
he wasn't happy with it either. He complained publicly about it.
Right. Yeah, and he probably just brought it into the national attention that ESG is being used to potentially manipulate various goings on in companies.
Yep.
environmentalism was a topic that I wanted to cover since last summer, um, particularly because for those on the right, it's not inherently a terrible thing.
Right.
Stewarding the land and all this other stuff, not bad. And in fact, there's virtue to be found in it. The terrible thing is that it's been almost monopolized by left-wing activists and partisans that completely turn the subject into a dirty word and completely cut off from it.
Well,
And the other thing is,
in particular, as usual, their agenda is not what they say it is, right?
and
They
and the
say
other thing,
they say it's about how much they love nature, but mostly it's about how they want to impose a socialist economy and et cetera, right?
right,
It's these other
exactly.
things. Yeah.
The other thing is that it's not just about left wing sort of destruction of civilization, just by what they say at face value. It's also just an agenda that the state and other massive corporations backed by the state use to suppress dissent and keep everyone in line. So,
Right.
um, this is why I wanted to
It's a
talk about
stick.
also,
Environmentalism is a stick, right?
right. And there's it could be seen that this is one of the weaker areas that people on the right have. It's a vulnerability. It sounds bad to be against the environment, either due to natural inclinations or perhaps propaganda. And it doesn't have to be, is the annoying thing. The right has a lot to offer there and a lot to counter with how it's been played out in propaganda. So this could
Agreed.
perhaps be a future.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree that sometimes, and this is what you don't want to do, right? Is you're opposed to the current thing. Let's say it's environmentalism, right? And so you show how edgy and awesome and opposed to the current thing you are by just like going to some ridiculous extreme on the opposite side.
Right.
Nuke the planet. I don't care. Nothing matters. It's like,
Right.
yeah, well, that's fun, and that's maybe you get a fun meme out of it or a joke, right? But that doesn't really persuade thoughtful people,
Right.
who like walking in the woods and like trees and stuff, and which is a perfectly reasonable perspective, right?
Right. It has different consequences, but this is the same trap that you fall into if you look at inflation and say, well, the Fed needs to go to a tight monetary policy.
Excellent. Yeah.
Usually it's a bad idea to just take the exact opposite of whatever's being thrown at you.
Right.
Typically, it's a trap. You don't want to fall into it.
To quote War Games, Ryan, the only way to win is not to play the game.
Right.
We don't want to get drawn into their games. Okay, well, let's finish up some super chats. Actually, let me check if anyone sent a tip in through Subscribestar. Okay, then let me make sure I get all my super chats here. Okay. Oh, we've got quite a few actually. But they haven't scrolled off, which is nice. I get to look at them looking pretty. I just can't show them on the screen. They were on the screen when they first came through. But okay, Zorro9129 says there's a computer game called Corporate Mercenaries where McDonald's fights McVanyas. Goofy and fun. I have not heard of that. Yeah, didn't they used to talk about, what is it, Coca-Cola death squads and stuff like this? Yeah, this is a long-running joke, right?
Yeah. I mean, personally, Coca-Cola Death Squads was one of my favorite meme cycles for AA and his group.
Right. Pixar Moldbug says, I'm glad I managed to eat McDonald's in Moscow before the end. That's cool. It was full of drunk Brits. Yeah, I actually have visited Moscow. I studied Russian a little bit in college and have a big interest in the Russian people and Russian literature and things like that. And so I actually visited Moscow in 2001, the summer of 2001, and got to hang out with a very serious young Orthodox believer there, and visit some important Orthodox sites and so forth. And somehow we skipped McDonald's, so I missed my chance.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's cool that you went though, sir. Okay, Sam153 says, does this mean the Russians will topple Ronald McDonald statues like Lenin?
That would be funny.
Our friend Charlemagne says, why bad man no like burger, except he spelled it in a funny way for some reason. Yeah. I feel like I've missed part of his joke there, Ryan. Anyway, no point in explaining it to the boomer.
Okay.
Um, okay, and I feel like there was no. Okay, Zero, Pixar, Sam. Yeah. Okay, I think I got everybody for today. Okay, cool. Thank you. Um, yeah. So couldn't get Black Horse, started to become a more regular presence on our econ minis because he brings some great knowledge of financial markets. He was unavailable today, but we are planning to have him in 2 weeks for the next econ minis, and we're going to update on a couple things. The Twitter story might have changed 5 more times by then, so I'm not sure about that. He's thinking of maybe putting something else on my Substack about that. We'll see. But there are some interesting trends continuing to go on in the markets. Take a look at Cisco stock price over the last week or two, for example, and you will see something a little surprising. Um, but anyway, there's I think a lot going on in the markets right now, so we'll be doing more of a regular sort of financial markets update with Black Horse, like we've been doing, and I've been really enjoying it. I would love more feedback from the audience, what you think of those episodes where we have Black Horse on, but I think it's been great, and he brings such great knowledge, and I always learn a lot. And I've almost been tempted to talk like I know something about financial markets, which historically I'm very careful to be clear that I don't know what I'm talking about. Don't take investment advice from me. I still don't want you to take investment advice from me, but it would be nice to just have a better sense of what's going on in the markets. So anyway, look forward to that. And then I actually don't know that we've decided what we're doing next week, but we will see you then, I think, doing something cool. And Ryan is mostly going to be with us this summer, except for occasional what is it, Finding Yourself trips or so. No, it's the right wing version. It's the right wing version of Finding Yourself trips, Ryan, right? It's hang out with the bros, something like that. Anyway,
Go find based friends, yeah.
but find base friends. Yeah.
I'll be going to Mises U
Yeah.
the last week of July. So
That's right. Yep.
Got that to look forward to. Yeah, so all these other things.
Oh, I know what I haven't mentioned, Ryan. Speaking of being off for conferences, I'll be going, Lord willing, and some money lines up.
Yeah.
I'll be going, ideally with my wife, we'll see, to the UK for the UK event, which is sort of the UK, or well, they were first, but Ryan and I both spoke at the February event with Aros Post, by the way, who had that first super chat, and Charlemagne. We all spoke at a Nashville event run by Schildings, and if I was smart, I would be having that link in the show notes and stuff. But how about I drop it in the live chat right now, and I'll point you right to the event. It's called the Witten, and it is going to be late August in the West Midlands area. Where's my live chat so I can drop that in there for you? And if you are in the UK or want to use the excuse like I'm doing to make a trip there, we're hoping to make this a 20th wedding anniversary trip. We've had our 20th wedding anniversary, but I wanted to do something really epic to celebrate it. So my wife has never been to England. She's much more of an Anglophile than I am. So please pray that everything works out with the logistics and the children being taken care of and money to make the expensive flights over and all that stuff. Or donate your Bitcoin. That'll help too, or whatever. How does it say? Obama Wakanda says, looking forward to seeing you, Radlib. Albion will welcome you with open arms, I am sure. Thank you. I really look forward to meeting folks over in the UK. It's long overdue. AA was kind of nice enough to travel to the US and coordinate meeting up with me at a conference in 2019, so I've gotten to meet him. But all my other UK friends are virtual. I have not met. Who are we going to have there? I'm trying to remember. Do you remember? Oh, well, I've got the thing up. I'll mention who's speaking. Who do we have as speakers lined up?
Sargon, Panama Hat.
Sargon, Panama Hat. That's right. Here we go. Alexander Adams, academic agent, will be there. Curtis Yarvin, if you've heard of him. He also went by the name Mencius Moldbug. They seem to have lined him up. He's on the ticket, on the bill. So and then there'll be more speakers.
Will Farrah be there? Is he on the list?
He's not on the list yet. I've encouraged someone who's been on the channel to apply and go, who's in the UK. Well, but I won't say who until he gets accepted, but I'm sort of I'm urging him to do it so I can meet him in person and he can speak because he's super sharp. But anyway, really looking forward to it. Would love to see some of you folks there and meet you in person. Ideally with my wife. We'll see. Okay, well, I got to wrap it up and bring kids to karate. Thank you, Ryan, for joining me week after week when you don't have an awesome class with Per Bieland, which is the best excuse in the world to miss this show. So, okay, I think we're done, and I'll try credits, but they probably won't work. Technical problem there. Thanks, everybody. See you all next week.